Stories about the heroics of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion are nearly endless. They were integral to the success of D-Day, and part of the Commonwealth contingent that made it the furthest east. Their final wartime action was to liberate Wismar, Germany, or rather to push the Allied Comintern line as far east as possible. Churchill wanted to rob Stalin of more continental Europe on which to create people's republics. This won't be an exhaustive investigation into one can para as they're known. That's for someone more talented and well-versed in the military world. This is just us sharing a few of the odd circumstances and stories they found themselves in between the time they dropped over Normandy until the Russians rolled up to Wismar and nearly started another war. Let's dive into the race to Wismar. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was a contingent of 6 British airborne, and as previously stated, dropped behind enemy lines during D-Day. To say the drop over Normandy went sideways is a gross understatement. In 2004, Lieutenant Colonel Bernd Horn and archivist Michael Vachensky would gather past interviews and collect new ones from paravets. Most describe the chaos like a comedy of errors. Before they were even flying over the French mainland, German 88s pounded the skies with flak, forcing pilots to commit risky, evasive maneuvers. Many paras would be prematurely ejected over the English Channel, doomed to the cold water below. Sergeant Major John Kemp recalls waiting at the door for the jump light to come on when his plane was hit by a shell. The wing was heavily damaged and he was pushed out by all the men behind him. He recalls men so scared they didn't care if their chutes opened or not. Captain John Simpson recalls the planes moving as fast as possible. That sounds like a good idea until you realize the jump door is behind the engine exhaust. He exited the plane only to be shot backwards by a backfire, ripping all of his equipment off in the process. He landed with just a pistol, a few stray rounds, and barely his uniform. Due to the sheer number of troops in the sky, accidents were bound to happen. Corporal Tom O'Connell jumped and lost control of his chute thanks to a jet stream. He was forced into another trooper and the two plummeted to the ground at terminal velocity. When he awoke from his concussion, he asked if the other guy was okay. He wasn't. Tom had broken his fall landing on one of the battalion's chaplains, Honorary Captain George Harris. I'm not a religious man, but even I see that as somewhat of a bad omen. Private Doug Morrison landed on what he assumed was a green field, but ended up neck-deep in water. The Wehrmacht had flooded vast swaths of French countryside and let it go to bloom. The green algae blended in with the regular pasture vegetation, leading paras to aim for the open space to make it easier to tidy up their chutes. Many hit the water and never came up. Sergeant W.R. Kelly hit a tree and was flung upside down. His foot tangled in the various knotted paracord. His head landed just far enough down to be submerged, and for hours he would lift it ever so often just to catch his breath. Thankfully, a few comrades found him and cut him loose. After the survivors collected themselves, they had a new problem. Where the hell do we meet up? Thanks to the fast-flying planes and strong wind, the paras were sprinkled all over Normandy with no real rhyme or reason. This made it easy for the Wehrmacht to take them apart piecemeal. Corporal Dan Hartigan mentioned that upon landing during D-Day, the unit lost more than 50% of their officers in small, isolated skirmishes or by capture. So without a commissioned command structure, surely the paras were doomed. Nah, they're paras after all, a well-trained and well-drilled force that dares and wins. They would complete their objectives of securing small French hamlets and destroying artillery batteries throughout the early morning skirmishes. At the end of the first 24 hours, Horn and Vachensky claimed that out of 541 paras dropped, 116 were captured, killed, or wounded. The regular Canadian forces would go on to clean up much of the remaining parts of France as the rest of the Allies marched towards Berlin, one can para in tow. In Russell Dixon's memoirs, he recalls how miserable, but calm his time was in Belgium. One can para was stationed at the northern tip of the Battle of the Bulge, and saw very little action because of it. But the low country winters, those were another story. Dixon was a Calgary boy by way of Brampton, Ontario, so he knew what humid and dry winters were like. The Belgian cold was miserable in comparison, he said. But hey, could be worse, right? They could be doing another daring jump in the cold. Well, that's what we in the biz call foreshadowing. After a short leave in February back in England, the boys from One Can Para were packing their chutes. On March 24th, 1945, they would be jumping again, this time from the west side of the Rhine River to the east, hopefully hitting the town of Wessel. By 10 a.m., Operation Varsity would commence, the largest paradrop in a single day in all of history. Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicklin, part of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the first Western Canadian team to win the Grey Cup, would drop over Wessel and be shot when he was caught up in a tree. The battalion's only Victoria Cross recipient, Medical Orderly Corporal Fred Topham, performed his heroic actions on this very day. Despite seeing 2 other orderlies get shot tending to a wounded soldier, he would rush out to the exact same spot and provide aid. Topham was shot in the nose but kept going and carried the soldier back to safety. For 2 hours, Topham kept giving aid to those in need and refused his own. When he finally got through helping the casualties, he made his way back to the company headquarters, where he saw a bombed-out Bren carrier. It was on fire and had 3 soldiers in it. Defying a direct order from a superior officer to not go assist those men, he did anyways, and managed to get all 3 to safety. Of them, 2 would survive to see another day. Since Lieutenant Colonel Nicklin had died, the battalion's command moved to the 2IC, second in command, then Major George Fraser Eadie. Eadie, by a number of veteran accounts, was the perfect man for the job. He was well-liked, whip-smart, and knew how to get things when he wanted them. An immediate promotion to lieutenant colonel, and command of the battalion was laid on his lap. By April of 1945, German Field Marshal Busch, in charge of Hamburg, and General Lindemann, in charge of occupied Denmark, both sent out requests of occupation to General Eisenhower. They wanted to be occupied by the Allies. Eadie had his orders and his time frame. Drive to the Baltic Sea immediately. Besides a sobering stop at Bergen-Belsen to help out with the camp's liberation and cleanup, the road was mostly open. Russell Dixon remembers the 300-kilometer journey fondly. They begged, borrowed, and stole rides from every manner of machine, from trucks to tanks. The mostly surrendered Germans didn't have a care if an invading army was upon them. Life just continued as usual, as long as they weren't getting shot at. The battalion ran out of their supplies often and had to subsist on freshly butchered chickens or upturned gardens of the farms they passed by. It was a shock to the inspectors when they found them eating fried chicken on the side of the road. Dixon mentions that he wore women's underwear for the majority of the drive, as he found a motherlode in a vacated home, and HQ was out of the Army issue ones. But underwear wasn't the only thing in short supply. During the rush to the north coast, one Canberra was to be inspected by a British officer. Private Jan de Vries recalls that they showed up to the inspection with various paras wearing German smocks, boots, equipment straps, and of all things, some even had bowler hats on. The officer was especially confused when he came upon a trooper wearing a sweater with the words Flin Flon knitted into it. While shocked, the officer was reassured by Eadie that despite the dress code, the paras were committed wholeheartedly to their task. The battalion itself was in lockstep with the Royal Scots Greys as they thrust to cut off the Soviets. And it was a good thing too. The sheer number of prisoners they encountered was unprecedented. There are figures like 3,000 fully armed and equipped soldiers lining up to be processed and taken to POW camps. The Greys recall a Panzer Mark III rolling up in the line of prisoners to queue up for surrender. Eadie himself made off like a bandit and found a German officer and stole his staff car. And that wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, the sheer number of captured or stolen vehicles caused a petrol shortage for the northward push. By May 2nd, 1945, the finish line was in sight. The tanks from the Royal Scots Greys fired to life at 5 a.m. just outside Boisenberg, on the west side of the Elbe River. The goal was to hit Wittenberg by noon, but thanks to the full surrender of the Wehrmacht in northern Germany, they managed to get there by 9:20 a.m. As they hit Lutzau, the surrendering prisoners, civilian and military alike, blocked the road with their migration. When asked why there were so many of them, the prisoners said that the Soviets were likely 9 miles away from Wismar, and they didn't want to get killed or, well, I guess one way to say it is Berlined. With scattered cheers from onlookers, one Canberra and the Scots Greys peeled off with their transports and raced off to Wismar. That night, upon hitting the town, they found people friendly and the architecture beautiful. Positions were taken up on every bridge, rail crossing, and path into the city. If a Russian was in Wismar, one Canberra would surely know it. Aside from an earlier encounter with a scouting party, 2 hours later, as predicted, a Russian officer arrived at the town. Confused but relieved, this was the first time a Canadian unit had come up against a Russian one in Western Europe. He let them know of the impending approach of the Red Army and reminded them that Wismar was to be in the Russian-occupied zone. Edie noted that and sent him on his way. He had no desire to hand over the city at this moment. The official retelling makes the Russians sound like friendly alcoholics, but personal stories paint a much different picture. Thankfully, due to the sheer number of Alberta boys in the battalion, there were a bunch of fluent Russian translators. Private Jan de Vries was with Edie and the translators during first contact, and he recalls the conversation. The Russian officer's goal was to hit Denmark, and he told Edie to vacate the town. When he refused, there was a threat of violence, to which Edie responded, "You better have 10 men for my one." That didn't start the relationship off swimmingly. Once the Red Army hit the Canadian positions in force, predictably fraternization happened. Most paras abstained from the multitudinous liters of vodka that was present, but one soldier, Lieutenant P.G. Insole, is named on the official debrief as the battalion's designated vodka drinker, at least for the first meetup. Dixon recalls a darker side of the Soviets. More than a few members of the Russian infantry approached his post and tried to convince him to let them into Wismar to collect women. He recalls one soldier showing up with flowers in one hand and a Thompson gun in the other. Collect women. Yeah, right. Both sides couldn't come to a consensus, so they ran it up the flagpole. Major General Eric Louis Bowles, head of British 6th Airborne, entered the town and sat down with the Russian officer. When the officer told him to leave, Bowles reiterated Edie's position. Absolutely not. Field Marshal Montgomery saw this issue cropping up as both sides drew closer to one another. He released a statement a day before the paras took Wismar. It reads, "To avoid confusion and to prevent expansion into areas occupied by the Red Army, our troops will halt as and where they meet the Russian forces. The local commander will decide what adjustments are necessary in order to deal with any remaining enemy opposition. When all hostilities have ceased in the area, troops will be disposed of in accordance with military requirements, regardless of the ultimate zone boundaries." In other words, whatever Bowles said was law, and just because it was included in the Soviet zone of control on paper, they didn't have a say what to do with the surrendered soldiers and civilians as long as Canadians had control of the town. Well, there was only one move for the Russians to do, and that was to run it up their chain of command. Field Marshal Rokossovsky was brought in to negotiate down a conflict, followed by Montgomery himself replacing Bowles. 1 Canberra and the Scots Greys had bought the Allies enough time to occupy most of Schleswig-Holstein and prevent a Soviet push into Denmark. They also gave the citizens enough time to leave the town before any reprisals could happen. Just as negotiations were finishing up, on May 8, 1945, the Germans completely surrendered, ending the war in Europe. And that's just a few of the many amazing stories from the members of 1 Canberra. Maybe we'll do another one of these. I need an excuse to dive into the Loyal Eddies. Please let us know in the comments below if you like this. Thanks for watching.